existing. Got it. Well, with grammar still existing at the kind of top of the pile. And things like vocabulary or kind of working on your spoken English or on your listening skills still being placed further down the ladder. They're the kind of slightly unloved counts and countesses to King Grammar's kind of golden crown or golden throne. And this kind of status and snobbery about the status of grammar, I think, is reiterated from the top down. It's not surprising, I think, that we have this kind of status anxiety and snobbery about the way we think about grammar. Because on one level, it comes from teacher trainers themselves. When I used to run CELTA courses many moons ago at University of Westminster, I can remember one year we had our assessor come in from Cambridge near the end of the course to check on our grades, our projected grades for a couple of students. And those of you who've run CELTA courses, you'll know the way it works is the assessor comes in, they watch a couple of lessons, you give the grades that you think those lessons deserve, and they either verify and validate those grades or they argue with you and call into question your judgment. And one particular year, we had two teachers doing their final teaching practice. And one of them did a vocabulary-based lesson that was really, really well handled. She gave some brilliant examples. She worked through the answers really well. She explained the language really clearly. She asked great questions about the language she was looking at. She used the board well. There was a kind of meaningful, personalized practice. There was some feedback and some reformulation based on what the students had said. And both Andrew and myself, who were the trainers, were convinced she was an A-grade student. And at the end of the teaching practice, we went out for a coffee with our assessor. And the assessor asked us, what grade do you think this was? And we both said, it's a clear A pass. And the assessor sort of looked a bit uncertain and scratched his chin a little bit. And eventually said, well, it was a good lesson, but has she done a grammar lesson yet? Because really, grammar lessons are the proof of the pudding. That's when you can really tell the quality of a teacher. And if you're getting these kinds of comments from teacher trainers, it shouldn't be a surprise that teachers themselves also perpetuate this kind of snobbery. When I wrote my very first course book, Innovations, back in the year 2000, many moons ago, I was sent out round the UK to go and do some talks in various language schools and centres. And one of the places I went to was Cambridge, which I didn't realise at the time, but am now very aware of. It is home to a very particular breed of English language teachers. Often it's home to people who see themselves as the guardians of the Queen's English and all that is good about her. And I gave this presentation basically talking about how if we want students to get better at speaking English, we need to make sure they're exposed to a lot of spoken English. They need to see models of how everyday conversations work. And within that, that will involve them spending more time looking at fixed expressions, semi-fixed expressions, collocations, chunks, and so on, as well as more traditional kind of grammar-oriented areas. And at the end, I said, does anyone have any questions? And immediately someone stood up and said, so basically, you're just recommending that we teach language for Swedish au pair girls. And I was really taken aback by this peculiar comment because A, I obviously wasn't advocating we only teach language for Swedish au pair girls. And B, I wasn't aware that Swedish au pair girls spoke a special brand of English that required different input. My experience of Swedish au pair girls, limited as it was, basically led me to believe that they just spoke very, very fluent, normal, everyday spoken English. Another comment I had from a teacher I used to work with was a rant about some of the Swedish kids who were in one of our proficiency classes. And the teacher came up to the staff room after a lesson, ranting and raving, saying, "Oh, the Swedes, they're useless, they're useless." I was wondering what the problem was. And my fellow teacher said, "They may be very fluent, but they don't even know what the present continuous is." When I pointed out that they were all quite capable of using the present continuous in many shapes and forms, that the teacher sort of got annoyed and said, "That's as maybe, but they couldn't name one if it bit them on the nose." And to me, this seems like a good problem to have. If you can use something without even knowing what it is, well done you. That's like a lot of fluent speakers of their own mother tongue. You know, they use the language fluently without necessarily being able to dissect it. And of course, these kinds of attitudes also trickle down to students. So often when you talk to students about their perceived strengths and weaknesses, what they'll say is things like, "My grammar's terrible. I know words, but I need to study more grammar." Students even say this when they come into proficiency level classes, okay? And, you know, it's like they've already done Raymond Murphy's English Grammar in Use twice. They come to a proficiency class saying, "I need more grammar." And I have to break the bad news to them that we haven't got any more grammar because they've done it all already twice. But it doesn't surprise me that students perceive their own shortcomings in this kind of way, given the trickle down of anxiety and snobbery and status about the role of grammar from people higher up in the ELT food chain. I started thinking about all of this in terms of "the king is dead, long live the king" many years ago, because, excuse me, I warned you about the cup of tea. When I used to work at Westminster, one year we were actually visited by the real Queen, Queen Elizabeth II. And it was a very surreal experience because basically, to begin with, they spent hundreds of thousands of pounds cleaning all of the toilets, well, the women's toilets. The men's toilets were just left dirty and horrible as usual. They cleaned the women's toilets. They cleaned all of the chewing gum from the pavements for 100 meters either side of the university, outside the building. So when you were walking down Regent Street, suddenly you'd come to this kind of spotless piece of pavement and you'd think, "What's happened here?" And you'd realize that all of the big kind of black lumps that you usually see flattened onto London pavements had been scraped off during the night. They got someone to go round the classrooms that the Queen was going to visit and like scrape off all the dick pictures and graffiti and everything that was on all of the buildings. And they then hand selected or cherry picked a few teachers who were allowed to meet the Queen. These were the kind of ardent royalists. They had a few students who were allowed to meet the Queen and they were taught how to kind of bow and scrape and curtsy and how to walk out of the room backwards so the Queen never had to see your back. And the rest of us were locked upstairs in the staff room for the day. They gave us a coffee machine and some ashtrays and said, "Don't dare try to come down while the Queen is here." And so the Queen came and the Queen went. And of course, none of us got to see her. But afterwards, we went to the pub to digest the day's weirdness. And whilst we were in the pub, it suddenly occurred to me that the Queen probably had no idea that chewing gum existed. She almost certainly had no idea that the streets of the city she lived in were covered in chewed up, spat out, stomped on bits of chewing gum. She probably thought that all toilets everywhere in London were beautiful and spotless and clean. And she probably had no idea that bored students sat there drawing penises on their desks when they were half asleep during lectures. The view of the world that the Queen had was a very, very weird one, a very kind of sanitized, cleaned up kind of view of the world, with all of the reality and the grit and the dirt and the normality whitewashed out of it. After another point, it suddenly occurred to me that this was very similar to the way I used to think about language, and to the way that I think lots of course books actually present language to students. And I think it's then worth asking yourself, well, is grammar what makes the difference between an intermediate level student and a proficiency level student? Well, let's look at some evidence. What you can see here are some multi-choice questions from a recent proficiency exam, okay? And to pass this exam, you need to know that you take, you take up residence in an area. You need to know that if you want to relax, you don't prowl, unless you're some kind of obsessive stalker lunatic. You probably don't stumble because that's quite difficult and you fall over because you're drunk. But to relax, you stroll down a street. You need to know that new buildings spring up. They don't gather up, pile up or move up. You need to know that the tourism industry before COVID may well have been flourishing, okay? You need to know that things fall out of favor rather than approval or opinion. And even the one that's kind of a little bit grammatical, the one which is much as some may grumble that blah, 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 there's no doubt that blah, 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 isn't grammar in the Raymond Murphy sense of the word. It's not grammar in the English file sense of the word. It's not the present perfect or the past simple passive or the third conditional. It's much more this complicated interrelationship between grammar and vocabulary. And obviously, if you're going to learn all of this stuff in order to pass something like Cambridge Advanced or Cambridge Proficiency, you can't spend the first 600 hours of your learning career basically just stressing about the difference between the present simple and the present continuous and the present perfect simple and the past simple. You have to start learning some of this stuff much, much earlier. You have to start building up and developing an awareness of the way in which words interact with words and the way in which words interact with grammar from the earliest days of your teaching, of your learning experience. I think one of the problems is that the way we think about grammar and the way that grammar is prioritized within English language teaching can actually get in the way of a happy, productive kind of life, because it creates this awful medical condition called grammar anxiety. Now, you may not have heard of this terrible medical condition, but trust me, it's very real. Some of you may even be suffering from grammar anxiety yourselves, but you've simply not had it diagnosed yet. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of what happens when people suffer from terrible grammar anxiety. I was doing a pre-intermediate class once, and we were talking about holidays. And we were looking at some common questions that you might ask your partner about the place they went on holiday. And we were looking at things like, what was the food like? What was the weather like? What were the people like? What was your hotel like? What was the food like? And they were matching these questions to answers. And then they were walking around saying, so where did you go for your last holiday? Oh, right. What was the food like? What was the weather like, etc.? And I had an Italian guy in my class who was grammar obsessed. He couldn't digest a piece of language unless he'd first dissected it and analysed it and labelled it. And he looked at this sentence, what was the food like? And he repeated it to himself a couple of times. What is it like? So I said, Luigi, well, what's the problem here? And he said, like, what is it like? Like, it's a verb. And that's a seemingly easy question. So my first answer was, no, it's not. It's not a verb. It's a what was it like? Okay, it's basically a fixed question that we ask when we want someone to describe something. Maybe in Italian, you say, how was it like? Or how was it? Okay, just learn it as a fixed question and don't think too much about the individual parts. This bugged me because I don't like not knowing answers to student questions. So I went home and I looked it up, and the first dictionary I looked it up in said, it's a preposition. And I thought, that can't be right, because when you ask what's it like, you're not asking if it's like something. It's not like saying what's it next to, or what's it opposite, or what's it above. You don't say, what's your mother like? She's like an elephant. It's not how you answer those kind of questions. What's she like? She's lovely, my mum. So I started thinking, well, that can't be right. It can't be a preposition. The next dictionary I looked in said function word. This is what they call things when they can't decide what they are, basically. So the lexicographers obviously just thought, Jesus, I've no idea what we call this. Let's call it a function word. The last dictionary I looked in said function word / preposition. So I looked in 3 different dictionaries, and all of the assembled wisdom of all of the lexicographers there couldn't agree on what like was. But 2 of the 3 dictionaries had little boxes saying, when we want to ask people for descriptions of things, we often ask questions like, what was the weather like? What was the food like? What was the hotel like? Lovely. In another class, I was doing a revision test, again, pre-intermediate level. And it was just a multi-choice thing, like, have you been or have you gone to Mexico before? Excuse me, almost finished. Yeah. And we were going through the answers. And I had 2 students in there. One was a guy from Russia and another was a woman from Mexico. And when we came to this one, it was like number 3. Okay, have you? And at exactly the same time, the Russian guy shouted out, gone, 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 gone. And the Mexican woman said, been, been, been. Okay. And I said, well, the correct answer is, have you been to Mexico before? And the Russian guy got really annoyed and said, how do you know what's the rule? And my Mexican student said, the rule. I never hear anybody say gone. I hear people say, oh, you're from Mexico. I've been to Mexico before. Oh, have you been to Guadalajara? Have you been to Caracas in Venezuela? I've been to Russia. I've never been to Spain. I hear this. I don't hear, have you gone? And I thought that was really interesting, that basically she'd got to a point where she knew the correct answer, not because she'd learned a rule, not because of Raymond Murphy and his English grammar in use, but because of her experience of and exposure to everyday spoken language. So I'm going to suggest that if we want to try to cure grammar anxiety, we need to think about how we do it, okay? A few years ago, I read a wonderful book by a kind of British popular philosopher called Alan de Botton. And he was writing about kind of status anxiety and the way in which we judge ourselves as human beings by looking who's above us and what do they have that we don't have. And I've adapted his advice about how to avoid status anxiety. and changed it to suggest ways we can cure grammar anxiety. So, with apologies to Alan de Botton, how can we help being snobs about grammar when all of this nonsense is set before us? Down with the course books, those engines and propagators of grammar. How greatly the levels of grammar anxiety would diminish if only ELT materials were to exchange just a fraction of their interest in the present perfect or modal verbs for a focus on the significant patterns and lexis of ordinary conversation. Now, I'm hoping that you were sent a handout, okay? If you weren't, this next part won't make much sense, but I'll just talk through what the handout was about in the first place. This was based on something that I had to do.
Short remark, Hugh, short remark. I've made the handout available in the chat box. Yes,
oh, thank you very much.
Everybody is able to open it up and have a look at it.
Thank you very, very much. That's very kind of you. Yeah, it's there. Teaching spoken English. So basically what this was I had to cover a class a few years ago, and I was literally sent into the class with 5 minutes warning. And in the course book, it was a pre-intermediate level lesson, and it was a presentation of a particular grammar point. And the conversation was basically deranged because it went like this. I'd like to buy a bicycle. What kind of bicycle should I buy? You shouldn't buy a new bicycle. It's too expensive. You should buy a second-hand bicycle. Where should I look? You shouldn't look in shops. You should look online. And it went on like this, basically. It was like, how many examples of should in positive, negative, question forms, first person, second person, third person, can we squeeze into one 12-line conversation? And this is very common to anyone who uses certain kinds of general English course books. There are many examples of these kind of deranged conversations where you present the grammar only in conjunction with other examples of the same grammar structure in conversations that don't really feel real or true. So you get things like, you know, where are you going to go for your holiday? We're going to go to Finland. No, you're not. You're not going to go to Finland. We're going to change your holiday. We're going to send you to Florida. Woohoo, we're not going to go to Finland. We're going to go to Florida. And we wonder why students struggle to use grammar in the real world. Well, what I decided to do was, I hated this lesson so much, and I hated the kind of insane practice, like, you know, I've got a headache, what should I do? You should not cut your head off, you should take aspirin. How many aspirin should I take? You should not take 20, you should take 2. Thank you for that wonderful advice, doctor. You're a genius. So I decided to kind of just rewrite how I thought a conversation about buying a second-hand vehicle might work, okay? And in the chat box there, basically what you've got in this teaching spoken English thing that I'll just click open. Let me just see if it works and doesn't crash the system. Yeah, you've got this little conversation that basically goes, how are you going to get to your new job? I was thinking of buying a motorbike. What, new or second hand? I'm not really sure. Second hand, I guess. I haven't got that much money, really. I don't know. Do you know much about bikes? What do you reckon? Yeah, I used to have a bike, but I sold it. How much are you prepared to spend? Not too much. I don't know. 500 or 600 quid. I've no idea how much they cost. Well, it will have to be second hand then. You won't get anything for that price new. You should be able to get something decent second hand for that kind of money. Okay? So this was the kind of dialogue that I wrote, and hopefully when you're reading it, it will ring truer than, you know, what do you think I should buy? You should not buy a new one. You should buy a second-hand one. Where should I look? You should not look here. You should look there. Hopefully you'll recognize it's a bit more like a normal conversation, okay? Well, if you have more normal conversations in course books and in classrooms, it has several advantages. And one advantage is for the people who are loyal devotees of King grammar. For those people who think we have to have all of the Raymond Murphy's grammar in use, big grammar structures in the course book, that's fine. In normal conversation, you meet them all the time. In a lot of course books, in your kind of English file model, you meet them once in one huge, great big block across 3 pages in the course book, where you have conversations that only feature that one particular grammar structure, and then you don't see that grammar structure again for the rest of the book, because in the next unit, you're focusing on another grammar structure in glorious isolation. Well, in normal everyday conversation, we don't only ask and answer things in one tense, okay? I might ask you, have you been to see the doctor about it? And you say, not yet, I'll wait and see how I feel tomorrow. Have you been to see the doctor about it? No, I've got an appointment for this afternoon. Have you been to see the doctor about it? No, I'm going tomorrow. Have you been to see the doctor about it? Not yet, I was thinking I might go tomorrow. Why did you decide to do that? I don't know. I've been thinking about it for ages. So, you know, yeah. What are you doing tonight? I'm not sure. I was vaguely thinking of going out somewhere. We do this all the time in everyday spoken language, but in course books, we often deny students the opportunity to see how tenses interact with other tenses. If we have more natural everyday conversation in the classroom, both in terms of classroom dialogues and classroom models, but also just in terms of chatting with students in a normal human way, as opposed to what would you do if you won the lottery? Good, and what would you do if you won the lottery? Instead of this, just actually having conversations with students, well, one thing that happens is you get regular repeated exposure to all of these kind of king grammar structures in typical everyday usage, okay? So you get things like, you know, you should be able to find something. It was interesting because when I wrote that conversation, I didn't think about the grammar as I was writing it. When I looked back at it, I realized I didn't have a single should for advice. The only should I had was, you know, I think you will. You should be able to get something decent for that price. And you have examples of things like will, won't, going to, might, could, should, would. So through seeing and experiencing more conversation in class, students have more regular, repeated chances to get to grips with the core grammar structures of the language. But it's better than that, because on top of that, you also get exposure to these little everyday patterns. So you get things like, I was vaguely thinking of getting something secondhand, okay? Where you use the past continuous to talk about a vague future plan. You get things like, there's no point buying something cheap, which is then going to break down, okay? And again, when you look at things like FCE, CAE, CPE, it's often these little kind of gray areas between vocabulary and grammar that are tested. You get things like what, new or second-hand? What, manual or automatic? What, online or face-to-face? Where the X and the Y change depending on what you're talking about. And, you know, often if you only know one of the words in the pair, it's quite difficult. Would you like still water? No. Gas. Yeah, sparkling. Still or sparkling. Yeah, manual or automatic, new or second-hand. So you can look at those little kind of patterns. We spend a lot of time in language teaching doing endless superlatives. So you do these kind of mind-numbing lessons about the cheetah is the fastest animal, Mount Everest is the highest mountain. Much more useful, especially at elementary level, spend more time looking at the single most useful superlative, the best, okay? And there are countless patterns like Who's the best person to talk to? Where's the best place to look? What's the best time to call you? Where's the best place to eat? Okay, where's the best place to stay? That's a really useful kind of chunk, often used in questions, that we don't teach because we're too busy focusing on what the longest river in the world is. In the same way, we're so obsessed with should for giving advice that we don't teach things like you're probably best looking online. You're probably best talking to someone else who knows more about it. So again, looking more at everyday speech and everyday spoken language allows us more opportunity to explore and expand on some of these common generative kinds of patterns. Beyond that, you've also got these kind of pragmatic patterns and the language that the pragmatic patterns come wrapped up in. So you've got things like double questions. Do you know much about it? What do you reckon? Have you heard anything from him? What did he say? Have you been there before? What did you think of it? You've got things like expressing uncertainty and asking for an opinion. I don't know. What do you reckon? I'm not sure. What would you do in that situation? I haven't got a clue. What do you think? You've got things like stating your choice and giving a reason. Secondhand, I haven't got that much money. Still, please, the sparkling doesn't agree with me. Manual, I can't stand driving automatic cars. And you've got things like making suggestions and expressing your reason, okay? So things like, you need to be careful. There's no point buying something cheap, which is then going to break down. Someone needs to mute themselves there because I can hear them stirring things and cooking. So I'm just going to mute whoever that was. I hope your dinner's as nice as it sounds like it is. So you can look at these things if you want to as well. They're available to the teacher and to the student should you wish to explore them. You've also got little patterns. You've got problem, offer, check and accept, reassure, check again, reassure, clearly accept and thank, state action and make decision. And you can look at how those kind of patterns work and what language you might need to, meet those kinds of outcomes. You've then got sort of just interesting common words. So you've got things like, what do you reckon? Okay, I reckon you'd be better off doing this. How much are you prepared to spend? And interestingly, things like prepared and decent, they have their own grammatical patterns. They're generally used in questions and in negatives. I'm not prepared to work weekends. Are you prepared to work evenings? How much are you prepared to pay? You can't get a decent cup of coffee anywhere around here. Do you know where I can get a decent pint of Guinness round here? And then, if you're studying somewhere like the UK, you might also have interesting words like quid, okay, meaning pound. Interesting because the plural is quid. 1 quid, 10 quid, 500 quid. In the same way, 1 grand, £1,000, 10 grand, £10,000. So if students are studying here, those are things that you might want to look at. And those are things that a focus on normal, natural conversation allows you to explore and to dig into in that kind of way. What? Fish, 1 fish, 10 fish. Yes, sorry, my son is eavesdropping on my presentation. So I guess what I would like to kind of conclude with before I throw it over to you for questions is to persuade you that even though King Grammar is still alive and well and dominating many English language course books, obviously not the outcome series, we do things differently over there, but it's still dominating a lot of English language course books, a lot of tests, a lot of assessments, and a lot of training courses, and it's deep in a lot of teachers' minds. And I think it's time to kill King Grammar. And so I think if we're going to assassinate the king collectively because it needs to be a collective effort, a bit like Murder on the Orient Express. Who done it? We all done it. If we're going to kill the king, it means doing a few things. It means stopping thinking of grammar and vocabulary as separate things. It means when you're teaching grammar, think about the vocabulary it's often used with, and think about the other grammar structures it often interacts with. When you're teaching vocabulary, think about the other vocabulary words you're looking at often interact with, and think about the grammar that often goes with the words you're teaching. And as with prepared and decent, sometimes there'll be particular little grammatical patterns that connect to particular kinds of words. It means just stopping thinking about words existing on their own. Words exist in relationships with other words and with grammar in particular kinds of contexts. And one of our jobs as teachers is to help students become more aware of those interactions with other language and with context. It means as teachers recognizing that one of our roles is giving better examples, often giving extra examples to the examples that our classroom material provides us with, and using the students maybe to elicit more, to get at more language, to explore the language around the language we're looking at. It means using the board to record chunks and extra examples. Or if you're teaching online, using your Word document or whatever you're recording new language on to note down and provide a record of chunks and new language. It means bringing material into the classroom that exposes students more to everyday conversation, to dialogues, to typical kinds of exchanges, both in terms of the classroom material, but also, as I said, in terms of the kinds of speaking that we engage in with our students and that we work on. And it means when you're teaching grammar, vocabulary, language, it means asking yourself, when would somebody say this? Why would they say this? Who would they say this to? And if the answer is never, no idea, to nobody, then you might want to ask yourself why you're teaching that and not something else. If the dialogue is, I've got a headache, what should I do? You shouldn't cut your head off, you should take aspirin. How many should I take? You shouldn't take 20, you should take 2. Again, when is students going to have this particular conversation? Why? Who with? If the answer is they're not, don't teach it. Change the material, change the focus, mix it up a bit. And maybe it means if you're looking at dialogues and little mini conversations and exchanges, you can do gap fills with them. You can gap out the key grammar words like going, might, would, will, could, if that's what you wanted to focus on. And you can do that more regularly and more efficiently because of the repeated exposure over time if you're looking at everyday normal conversation. And if you're bringing more dialogues into the classroom. And maybe, depending on your context, depending on the material that you're using, you might want to start writing your own material that reflects these kinds of things. For me personally, it was a belief in the importance of doing all of these things that led me to start becoming a coursebook writer in the first place, and that led to the innovation series and the outcomes series. So, grammar is dead. Not quite yet, but it should be. And maybe you can help me kill King Grammar. But if grammar is dead, long live what? Okay, because that leaves us with a bit of a conundrum. So I would suggest long live lexico-grammatical structures. There's still some grammar in there. For those of you who suffer from grammar anxiety, don't panic. You still get your grammar in there, just embedded within lexico-grammatical structures. Or if you prefer, grammar's dead. Long live grammaticalized lexis. Okay, again, you've still got your grammar in there for those of you who start suffering grammar withdrawal. For those of you who aren't so severely afflicted by grammar anxiety, maybe grammar is dead, long live curiosity and wonder in the ordinary. Because ultimately, for me, I think one of the things that's kept me in the job for so long, that's kept me interested in the job for so long, is that I learned how to move away from the narrow, quite restricted way that course books trained me to think in. And I started looking more at language as language is really used, grammar and vocabulary as they're really used, spoken language as it really exists. And when you start to do that, it's endlessly interesting. You're always learning and you're always noticing new things. In my last lesson of the day today, we had a sentence about the number of people getting married keeps falling year on year. And one of my students said, year on year. Can I say day on day? Can I say things are changing day on day? No. What about week on week? No. What about month on month? Never heard it before. Sounds weird. So is it only year on year? Yes, I think so, but I might be wrong. I'll have to go home and check it. So for me, in 28 years of teaching, I'd never stopped to think about year on year being fixed and not being transferable to days or weeks or months. Today, because I'm working with things students are trying to say and how to say them better, I suddenly notice this thing and I have a little moment of curiosity and wonder about the strangeness of everyday language. And I think if you want to stay curious and passionate about your job, you need to find the key to the door that takes you into those places. And you won't find it by doing banal conversations about what would you do if you won $1 million? I would buy a house. Where would you buy your house? Finally, grammar is dead. Long live learning and teaching. Because in the end, that's what this is all about. It's about learning how to use the language better, learning how to have normal kinds of conversations, learning how grammar and vocabulary interact across a wide range of different topics. And as teachers, helping students towards that learning, helping them to acquire the language in its most global and holistic sense that they need to achieve the outcomes that you want them to achieve. So I'm just going to finish by saying, please do check out our website, www.lexicallab.com. You can see more about the advanced level online speaking clubs, language classes we run there. We're also doing an elementary lexical approach Spanish course at the moment. You can also see more about the online teacher development courses we offer there. Anyone who wants to drop me a line, please do. It's hugh@lexicallab.com. If you've got any questions or proposals or suggestions or things you want to argue about, always happy to hear from people. If you're on Facebook, please do check us out, like us. It's facebook.com/lexicallab limited. And if you're on Instagram or YouTube, it's just Lexical Lab. Please find us and follow us. And thank you all very much for your time and attention. I think what I'd like to do, if possible, is just see if anyone's got any questions. If you do, throw them down in the chat box and I'll try and deal with them as they come up. Okay, I'll just scroll back and see if anyone's put anything ever before. Let's see. Nothing yet. I'm glad some of you enjoyed it. I'm glad you noticed there was some jokes in there. My son will be delighted with the 1 sheep, 5 sheep comments. I said you'll be delighted with the 1 sheep, 5 sheep comment. 10 quid, 1 quid, 1 fish, 10 fish. Where do you find real life dialogues? Well, obviously, I would suggest the best place to look would be in my series of course books called Outcomes, published by National Geographic Learning. We've tried to include graded dialogues that are still very realistic and relevant to kind of desirable student outcomes within the material that we've written. Other sources are obviously available also, but you'll have to find them yourself. Yes, Jean. Curse book. Dice. 1 dice, 10 dice. I'll talk to you in a minute. Sorry, curious son listening. Any ideas how to test grammar with a lexical approach in mind? Yeah, that's an interesting question, Anna. I think basically all you can do is test it in the context within which you've taught it, okay? So if you've taught something like, what was the food like? What was the weather like? What were the people like? What you then test is students' ability to reproduce those particular questions, okay? If you've taught the present perfect for talking about travel experiences, what you really test there is, have you been to, okay? And then you test things like, where did you go? When were you there? How long did you stay there? You don't test everything you might ever need to know about the present perfect. You test it very much within the context of specific kinds of conversations and specific utterances and examples that you've kind of taught and presented yourself, and don't expect students yet to be able to generalize too much from that. Lexical Grammar by Cambridge. Yeah, I do know it, by Leo Sullivan, who's a friend of mine. It's an interesting book. It's kind of different to what we've tried to do with the Teaching Lexically book. It's more a kind of a list of ways you can learn to explore language and dig into language yourself and with higher level learners, but well worth a read. Yeah, I'd recommend it. Read Teaching Lexically first, of course. How about teaching the grammatical structure function and changing the context? Not sure I understand the question. I mean, I think generally when you're teaching grammatical structures or functions, you need to be thinking about the context, that they need to emerge from a particular context, and they need to be practiced in a particular context. And I would say later, you'll re-meet that stuff anyway in different kinds of contexts. So just to give one example, if you're looking at the present perfect, okay, say at pre-intermediate level, you want to encounter it repeatedly in different contexts where you do different things with it. So it might be when you're talking about travel experiences, you're just looking at, have you ever been to? Maybe later, you're talking about society and social change. And you might look at the present perfect versus the present continuous. So it might be things like crime is getting worse and worse at the moment. Unemployment has gone up 10% this year. Prices are going up at the moment. Inflation has doubled over the last 6 months. Okay, so you're looking at the same grammar again, but through a different lens or a different window within a different lesson. Maybe later you do a lesson looking at problems and you have things like, my computer keeps crashing. Oh no, have you tried turning it off and turning it on again? Yeah, I tried that already, it didn't work. Oh, my colleague's driving me crazy. He keeps sending me creepy emails. Have you tried talking to the boss about it? No, but maybe I should. Okay, so I think it's important to kind of look at things in different contexts at different times like that. How to make elementary students not overwhelmed? Well, you don't overload the dialogues in a way, okay? And I'll just give one really simple example. So what a lot of course books do is when they teach I'm from or where are you from, because they're obsessed with teaching students everything they think they need to know about the present simple form of the verb to be. They don't just teach, where are you from? Okay, they teach, we are not German, we are Polish. Dracula is not Brazilian, he is Transylvanian. She is not Scottish, she is Welsh. Okay, it's like you have to learn every single form, positive and negative. But for me, this is insane, because like, why do I need to tell someone where Dracula is not from when I'm an elementary student? What we would do instead is to teach, where are you from? Okay, single word answer like Greece or Poland or Brazil, and then we'd teach whereabouts and some possible answers. Okay, so I would say actually what overloads students is learning, we are not Polish, we are Brazilian, Dracula is not Spanish, he is Romanian or whatever. Why are you learning that? For what? What's the use of that language? Much better to learn, where are you from? England. Whereabouts? London, the capital. Where are you from? Poland. Whereabouts? Krakow. Do you know it? Yes. Okay. Where are you from? Brazil. Whereabouts? Curitiba, in the south. Do you know it? No. Okay, that's not overload. It's just focusing on something different to what other course books will focus on, because we're more interested in how the conversation develops than endless practice of the grammar in weird contexts that you're never going to use it in. Giving advice, but changing the speakers, the context, the speaker's relationship. Could do if you want. I mean, I don't know. I don't really, we don't really have any lessons in outcomes just on giving advice. I think it's a weird thing to do generally, give advice to people. You know, I've learned this from talking to my wife, where she'll tell me about a problem and I'll try and tell her what I think she should do. And she'll tell me, did I ask for your advice? I just want you to listen.
Donesi mi ono od Nikole sušivo.
Okay. So I don't know. I mean, you could do if you wanted, but I generally don't myself. Clill. Sorry, let me see who I have to mute there. I think it's you. Clill. I don't know. I think there's a lot of problems with Clill, and a lot of the research I've read into Clill suggests that what ends up happening is students don't learn the content as well as they would learn it if they were learning it in L1, and they don't learn the language as well as they would learn it if they were just doing language lessons. So in some ways, I think with CLIL, you often end up with the worst of both worlds. If what you're asking is, do I think it's a good idea to look at grammar in the context of communication and readings and listenings? Laura's practicing her flute. Then yeah, I think it's useful to look at grammar in everyday contexts and everyday kind of communicative spoken and written texts. And that way you see how a range of different grammatical structures interact over a period of time in relationship to other structures, and you get more repeated exposure. So in that sense, I don't have a huge issue with it, but I think there are issues with CLIL generally. So I'll see if there's one more question coming in, and if not, I will bid you good night and leave you to your flute practice and whatever else it is you're doing. Thank you all very much for attending. Please do check out what we're doing on Lexical Lab and keep in touch and drop me a line. If anyone wants a copy of the slides, by the way, feel free to email me. And there's no need to call me sir, just Hugh is fine. You weren't muted, Laura. We all heard you. You sound very proficient on the flute. Hats off. Okay, thank you all very much and hope to see you all in 3 dimensions at some point before too long.
Yeah, thank you. It's been so inspiring. I feel
my batteries have been loaded
Ah,
in a
thank you.
positive way.
Thank you.
And so I think everybody would say the same. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And I'm glad I made it back in time. And thank you for
Yeah,
all your
you were.
patience.
That was perfect timing. Exactly on point.
2 minutes to spare.
Right. Goodbye, everybody, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care.
Beata, nice to see you.
Take care. Take care.
Good to see you, Lucy. Hello.
Yeah.